So what is motion blur? Well, that's the blur that's imparted by motion. All right, into video. Okay, not quite. One of the things that we've talked about when we're setting our exposure is shutter speed, right? What fraction of a second do we want to use? And what's the difference between those? And a difference is whether or not you can see motion blur, right? So if you were to take a picture of me as I'm sitting here and I was waving my hand across the screen, just that one little motion, right? If you took that picture with a high shutter speed, my hand would be frozen. It would be still. It would be sharp. There would be detail in it. If you took that picture with a low shutter speed, my hand would be moving while the exposure was happening. So there would be blurriness to my hand. You would lose the detail. There would be a streaking sense of motion there. Let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So I just went outside and I pointed my camera at the crosswalk. And as cars went by, I took snapshots to show you the difference here. Now, in this image, I used a high shutter speed, 1/200th of a second. And you can see the car clearly as it's going across the crosswalk there. It's sharp, it's well-defined, there's detail there. It wasn't moving very fast. There's a big speed bump just to the left of the frame there. So it looks nice and sharp. Now, I did the same thing this next image. I used a shutter speed of 1/2 a second. Half a second. Zzz. It was open. The image was exposed for 1/2 of a second. During that 1/2 of a second, you can see that the car crossing the crosswalk was moving. It traveled during that 1/2 a second. It was in motion, right? And because it was a slow shutter speed, it was blurred. That motion blurred it. This is motion blur. Notice that it's the only thing that's blurry, though. The street lights, the sidewalk itself, the parked cars, the building across the way, even the plants, all of these are nice and crisp and sharp because they weren't moving. So during a half second, nothing changed. They stayed still, they stayed sharp. That car, though, it looks like it's really streaking across there, doesn't it? I don't know, it might be doing 5 miles an hour. Let's try again. Now, this is another one that I took at 1/200th of a second. But this truck was clipping along, and if you look really closely, maybe if you just glance at it, it looks in focus, but if you really look at it, look at the tires, or look at the edges, the back edge of the tailgate or the front edge of the bumper. There's softness there. And it's not that it's out of focus. If you look at the things that are around it, you can see the focus is fine. What's happening is that truck was moving fast enough that even at 1/200th of a second, it blurred just a little bit, which tells me that guy was going way faster than the posted speed limit here on Second Road, even though he had just gone over that big speed bump. And one more. This again is at 1/2 a second, and that was a little, I don't know, SUV or RAV or something like that. But again, you can see that streakiness, that blurriness. The car is in motion. The car is going fast enough that during half a second, it's traveled, 3 or 4 feet there. So, yeah, everything else is crisp, everything else is sharp. So you can use motion blur like this to control what it is you want people to see, right? If the story a story about people driving too fast on campus, then maybe this slow shutter speed and this motion blur sells that point. It shows us how fast these cars are streaking through our streets. If the point is just to count cars and to identify the number of sedans versus pickup trucks versus SUV, probably you should have used the higher shutter speed so we get a clear image of each one. I love this photograph, and you've seen it before. I use it in my lecture on composition and aesthetics. The photographer used a slow shutter speed so that the subway cars, which were clipping by at a pretty good rate, would be blurry. But he was able to hold the camera still enough, even at that slow shutter speed, that the student in the foreground who's videotaping the subway cars is in focus. Probably this was about a 30th of a second. But this is a great example of using the shutter speed to control where your attention goes. Because the subway cars are blurry and out of focus, they are not the dominant element in this image. The student who's fascinated with the subway cars is the dominant element. This is another one I repurposed from a different lecture, but again, I like this photo. It shows the people in a state of motion while the subway cars or the trains are sitting there still. They're waiting to be boarded or unboarded. But this gives a sense of chaos, of urgency, of movement to the human element, to the people. You can also do this sort of thing by using motion blur. And you've seen these pictures before, these rivers of light where the traffic, the individual cars aren't there anymore. It's just streaks of light going through the city. And the city itself is clear. You can see the buildings, you can see the windows, you can see the details there because it's not moving. So this was a long exposure. If I had to guess, this was probably 5 or 6 seconds. Lots of cars drove through that frame and disappeared. They came into frame, they left frame, and the only thing they left behind was the trail of their headlights or the trail of their tail lights. And this goes the other direction. The photographer chose to use a high shutter speed, a very fast shutter speed, to capture the moment. We don't want motion blur in an image like this. I mean, look at that. You've got the student in the air shooting. You've got the other student in the air trying to block him. You can see the ball in flight, and it's all crisp, it's all clear because they used a high shutter speed. So motion blur is yet another tool in your arsenal that you can use to control what your image says. Adding motion blur implies motion. It gives movement, it gives speed, it gives a dimension that's often lacking in a static photograph. Whereas a crisp image, like these athletic images, just freeze that moment in time and preserve it for humanity. It's something that you should definitely experiment with and something you should know how to manipulate.